Hi there, I'm Paul Belflem and this is Industrial Organization. The topic of this presentation is sustainability of tacit collusion, and we'll be looking at some extensions of what we saw in the previous presentation. The learning objective hasn't changed, we just go further than the simple model of the previous presentation, and we rely here on sections 14.2.3, 2.4 and 2.5 of the textbook. The first extension has to do with the frequency of interaction between the firms. Okay, in the previous presentation, we assumed that at each period, the firms were repeating their interaction, were competing again against one another. Okay, now we change a little bit the assumption here by assuming instead that either firms only compete every k periods. Okay, so for example, they compete in period 1, then in period 3, then in period 5. Okay, and so they get profits only in period 1, 3, and 5, and so on and so forth. Okay, or this is scenario 2, they still compete in every period, but they cannot always change prices. Prices are set for k periods, and it's only after k periods that prices can be changed. Okay, so we want to know in these two scenarios what are the conditions for collusion to be sustainable. Okay, and we do, as we did before, we are looking for the conditions to have a Nash equilibrium, a subgame perfect Nash equilibrium, such that firms play the Grimm trigger strategy. Okay, and we continue to assume that firms compete à la Bertrand, they choose prices, they have the same products, okay, and we suppose that there are n firms in the industry. Okay, so let us look at the first scenario. I repeat, this is the case where firms compete only every k periods. So if one firm decides to cooperate while the other firms are still cooperating, well, every k periods, the firm is going to receive 1/n of the monopoly profit. Okay, so the difference with what we saw before is that this profit is not earned in every period, but only every k periods. Okay, and so the present discounted value of this infinite sum of profits is given by 1 divided by 1 minus delta to the k times 1/n of the monopoly profit. And if the firm deviates, then it's going to earn the monopoly profit for itself immediately. Okay? Now, in the second scenario, firms compete in every period, but can change prices only every k periods. Okay, so if they cooperate, well, they keep on having the 1/n of the monopoly profit at every period, and this is the present discounted value of this infinite sum. And if they deviate, well, then they will earn the monopoly profit for themselves, not just today, but for all periods before the other firms will be able to modify their price and punish by setting a price equal to the marginal costs. Okay, so if you compute this flow of profit in present discounted value, this is what you obtain. Okay, now, as before, we want to know what is the condition for firms to prefer to stay in the cooperation phase rather than deviating. Okay, so we need to compare VC to VD in the two cases, and if you do so, and you can check by yourself, you see that cooperation is preferable in both cases if this condition is satisfied. So if the discount factor is above some threshold, and the important result is that this threshold increases with k. Okay, so if k increases, it means that firms compete less frequently, or that prices can be changed less frequently. Okay, so this is why we can conclude that firms will find it harder to sustain collusion when they interact less frequently or when price adjustments are less frequent. Okay, it's harder for them to sustain collusion because this condition becomes harder to satisfy. It's harder to satisfy because the right-hand side here, the minimum threshold increases with k. Now, what is the intuition behind this result? Well, if firms interact less frequently, well, it means basically that there is more incentive to deviate. Okay, remember, the incentive to deviate comes from the fact that you can undercut the other firms, you can set a lower price than the price of the other firm and get the whole market for yourself. Okay, so the motivation to deviate comes from this immediate gain. Of course, you need to trade it off against the future losses, but if, and this is the key point here, if the interaction is less frequent, it means that the punishment is going to come later on. And so you can enjoy the gain of deviating for a longer period, which increases the incentive to deviate. And if the incentive to deviate increases, it means that firms have lower incentives to stick to the cooperation phase, and so it is harder to sustain collusion. Okay? Now, the reverse, exact reverse argument is to say that if firms interact more frequently, and this is probably the case today in e-commerce, when it's very easy to change prices and it's also very easy to repeat the competition, then we could expect tacit collusion to be easier to sustain. Okay, so the more frequent the interaction, the more frequent the price changes, the easier it is to sustain collusion. This is the exact reverse of the lesson here. Okay, another extension has to do with multi-market contact. What do we mean by multi-market contact? We mean that firms compete not just on one market, but possibly on several markets. Okay, think of airlines, think of Air France and British Airways. Well, they compete on several routes. Okay, not just Paris to, I don't know, to Madrid. On this line, you could take a plane from both Air France and British Airways. But if you look at the route between London and, say, Rome, you would also find competition between British Airways and Air France. Okay, so you've got many industries in which firms compete in several markets. Now the question is, does this multi-market contact facilitate or makes it harder to sustain tacit collusion? And a priori it's not easy to see what is the effect of these multi-market contacts. On the one hand, deviation is more profitable because by deviating you can earn profits on more than one market. Okay, so there is the immediate gain of deviation is multiplied by the number of markets on which you can deviate. But at the same time, this is the other side of the coin, the deviation is also more costly because the deviators will be punished on more than one market as well. Okay, so these two effects would just cancel one another if all the markets were perfectly identical. Okay, and if there was constant return to scale. So in a sense, in that case, being on one market or in two markets wouldn't make a difference. Okay, but if there is any difference between these different markets, it can be shown that the second effect dominates. The deviation is more costly, and the costs of the deviation is higher than what you can gain by deviating. Okay, and we know that if deviation is more costly, if firms will put more emphasis on the future losses of the punishment compared to the immediate gain of deviation, then they have lower incentives to deviate, which is to say that tacit collusion is easier to sustain. Okay, so this means that competition authorities may be more careful when they look at a competition between firms that compete on several markets, because they know from the theory that the prospect of tacit collusion may be higher because of these multi-market contacts. Okay, so let's move to another extension. So far, we have assumed that the demand across the periods was constant. Okay, which of course in reality is not true. Okay, there may be good states of demand and bad states of demand. Okay, so to take a silly example, think of two firms competing to sell umbrellas. Okay, well, clearly the demand for umbrellas is larger when it rains than when there is sunshine. Okay, so this is basically what we would assume here. There are two states of demand. Demand can be good or bad, and with some probability, it's either one or the other. Okay, and of course the good demand is such that for any price the quantity demanded is larger than in the bad demand case. Okay, now if we repeat the arguments we have made so far and we look at firms trying to sustain tacit collusion through a Grimm trigger strategy, for example, well, the result that we obtain is the following. It can be shown that under demand uncertainty, the critical discount factor above which the fully collusive outcome can be sustained is larger than under demand certainty. Okay, which, if you remember the argument, means that it's harder to sustain collusion because the discount factors of the firms must be larger than something which has become larger. Okay, so the condition to achieve tacit collusion becomes harder to satisfy. Now, without entering into the detail of this model, let's try to get the intuition. Okay, the punishment, and this is always what disciplines the firms, disciplines in the sense that it reduces their incentive to deviate from tacit collusion. Well, the punishment here is a flow of profits to be obtained in the future. Okay, but the future is unknown. The future can be high demand or low demand. When you make a decision to deviate today, you don't know what kind of demand you will receive tomorrow and the day after tomorrow and so on and so forth. Okay, so the firm that is contemplating deviation is going to compute an expected flow of future profits under punishment. Okay, and so in this specific case, it's going to be an average of high and low profits. And so this is less severe than if the good demand state persisted. Okay, so punishment under a low demand or bad demand state is not as severe as punishment under a good demand state. So if the firm knew that the demand would be good at every period in the future, it would fear more the punishment than in this case where it is just expecting that the demand can be good or bad with some probability. Okay, and so punishment being less severe, it is harder to sustain collusion. Okay, firms will have a larger incentive to deviate, meaning that collusion is harder to sustain. Okay, now we move to another type of uncertainty, which has to do with the unobservability of actions. Okay, and here the story is different. There is still demand uncertainty, but it's not something predictable. Okay, it's something that basically cannot be observed by the firm. So they may receive a low demand today, but the problem is that they don't know if this low demand is due to the fact that overall the demand is bad, or because the other firm has decreased its price and has attracted all the consumers. Okay, so the problem, I repeat, is that one firm observing a low state of demand is not able to attribute this low state of demand to an external shock or to a lower price that has been set by the rival firm. Okay? Now, again, I don't want to develop the whole model, but let me just give you the main ingredients. So we still suppose that firms, and there are just two of them here, produce a homogeneous product at the same constant marginal cost and compete à la Bertrand. Okay? Demand could be bad or good, bad with probability alpha and good with probability 1 minus alpha. Okay? And if firm faces zero demand, so if no consumer are showing up to a shop at some point, this shop doesn't know whether it's because demand is bad or because the other firm has set a lower price. Okay, so this is the main problem in this model, which is that firms, they really don't know when they should start the punishment phase. Okay? What should you and when should you punish the other firm? In the model we saw in the previous presentation, this problem did not arise. I mean, it was always possible to observe immediately that another firm had lowered the price. And so the punishment could be started immediately. But here, if you do the same thing, if as soon as one firm received zero demand, it starts the punishment, then it may punish for the wrong reason. It may be the case that the low demand is a consequence of an external shock and not because the other firm has lowered its price. And so it would be unfair and counterproductive to punish the other firm, because remember, the punishment is also a punishment for the firm that starts it. Okay, so the idea is to set a price equal to marginal cost, meaning that not only the firm that is punished, but also the punisher gets zero profit. Okay, so it is costly to punish, and you don't want to start the punishment phase for the wrong reason. But at the same time, you have to punish sometimes. Okay, because if you decide never to punish the other firm, then the other firm will of course have an incentive to lower its price and get the whole demand. Okay, so if tacit collusion wants to be sustained, some punishment has to be imposed, but in this case, not all the time, because it's costly to start the punishment. Okay, so this is what is described here, and we can show that it's possible to build a form of punishment that would be triggered by any low state of demand, but would last not forever, but for a limited period of time. Okay, and after this length of time, the firm would return to high prices. Okay, and with this type of punishment, it's possible to show that some degree of tacit collusion can still be obtained and sustained at the equilibrium. Okay, so let's read the lesson together. Even if firms cannot observe deviations of other firms from equilibrium play, collusion can still be supported to some extent. However, the conditions for collusion to be sustainable are stricter than in a world in which deviations can be immediately observed and punished. In addition, profits are lower. Okay, so this is the main messages that I wanted to share with you, but in a nutshell, what we have seen is that there are several reasons that may make tacit collusion harder to sustain. It could be because the interaction between firms is less frequent. It could be because there is some uncertainty about the demands. But we've also seen situations that make tacit collusion easier to sustain, and in particular, multi-market contacts between firms may actually facilitate collusion. Okay, so to summarize the whole thing, the potential for tacit collusion exists. It's hard to detect, but competition authorities need to be aware about that, and especially tacit collusion mechanisms, as the ones we have covered in these two presentations, can also be used by firms that explicitly collude, okay? Because this is a way for them to make sure that the members of the cartel will not deviate. Thank you for your attention.